The small community theater in downtown Cleveland was buzzing with nervous energy on that chilly October evening in 2018. Parents filled the worn velvet seats, cameras ready, programs rustling in their hands as they waited for the annual talent showcase to begin. The event had become a beloved tradition in the neighborhood, giving local children a chance to display their talents before a supportive audience. The stage lights cast a warm glow across the faded burgundy curtains as the master of ceremonies, a jovial middle school teacher named Mr. Patterson, welcomed everyone with his characteristic enthusiasm. He explained that tonight's performers ranged from age 5 to 15, and that the audience would be treated to everything from singing and dancing to magic tricks and instrumental performances. The crowd settled into their seats with the casual energy of people expecting an entertaining but informal evening. The kind of event where the charm came more from the children's earnest efforts than from polished performances. 7-year-old Emma Chen sat backstage in a plastic folding chair that seemed far too big for her small frame, her legs dangling several inches above the scuffed linoleum floor. She wore a simple navy blue dress that her grandmother had carefully pressed that morning, white tights, and black shoes polished until they gleamed. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail tied with a white ribbon that matched her tights perfectly. In her lap, she clutched a worn folder containing sheet music, though she had long since memorized every note of the piece she planned to perform. Emma's mother, Linda, knelt beside her daughter, gently squeezing her hand and whispering words of encouragement that seemed to disappear into the chaotic noise surrounding them. Other children rushed about in various states of preparation, some practicing dance moves, others humming scales, a few giggling nervously with friends who had come to support them. Emma remained still and quiet, her dark eyes fixed on a spot on the wall ahead of her, her breathing slow and deliberate as she mentally walked through each measure of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, known to most people as the Moonlight Sonata. It was an ambitious choice for someone so young, a piece typically reserved for intermediate to advanced players with years of training behind them. The composition, written in 1801, was one of Beethoven's most famous works, recognized worldwide for its hauntingly beautiful first movement that seemed to capture moonlight shimmering on water. The piece required not just technical proficiency but emotional maturity to interpret its depth of feeling, its sense of longing and melancholy that Beethoven had poured into every measure. Emma's piano teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, had initially hesitated when Emma expressed her desire to learn it 6 months earlier. The elderly Polish woman had taught piano for over 40 years and had seen countless students attempt pieces beyond their capabilities, only to become frustrated and discouraged when they couldn't master the technical demands or capture the emotional essence of the music. She believed strongly in matching students with appropriate repertoire, building their skills gradually through carefully selected pieces that challenged them without overwhelming them. But Emma was different from most students Mrs. Kowalski had taught over her long career. Mrs. Kowalski had recognized something special in the quiet girl from the moment Linda brought her for her first lesson 3 years ago, shortly after Emma's 4th birthday. Emma possessed not just talent but a profound connection to music that seemed to transcend her age and experience. She approached the piano with a maturity and focus that reminded Mrs. Kowalski of the serious young students she had taught decades ago in Warsaw, before immigrating to America in her 20s. When Emma played, she didn't just reproduce notes on a page with mechanical accuracy. She seemed to understand the emotional landscape of the composition, the sorrow and beauty and joy woven into every phrase. She listened intently to her own playing, adjusting dynamics and tempo instinctively to serve the music rather than simply following written instructions. Mrs. Kowalski had agreed to let Emma learn the Moonlight Sonata with one condition, that she truly commit to understanding it, not just mechanically playing it. She wanted Emma to research Beethoven's life, to understand the context in which he composed the piece, to feel the emotions he was expressing through the music. Over the following months, Emma had practiced with a dedication that amazed even her experienced teacher. Every day after school, she would sit at the old upright piano in her family's modest living room and work through the piece, section by section, never rushing, always listening to the sound she was creating. Her father, David, would often pause whatever he was doing just to stand in the doorway and watch his daughter's small hands move across the keys with growing confidence and grace. He would see her face completely absorbed in concentration, her body swaying slightly with the music, and he would feel his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and wonder at this remarkable little person he and Linda had brought into the world. Her older brother, Michael, who was 10, initially complained about the repetitive practicing, especially when he was trying to play video games or watch television. But eventually, he found himself drawn to the haunting melody that filled their home each evening, and he began doing his homework at the kitchen table near the living room so he could hear Emma play. The Chen family had immigrated from Taiwan when Emma was just 2 years old, and music had become a bridge between their heritage and their new American life. Linda had grown up in Taipei playing traditional Chinese instruments, particularly the guzheng, a beautiful stringed instrument that produced delicate, ethereal sounds. While David had been a casual guitar player in his youth, performing folk songs with friends during his university years in Taiwan. They had enrolled Emma in piano lessons partly as a way to provide her with cultural enrichment, and partly because they noticed how she would stop and listen intently whenever she heard music, whether it was playing in a store, on the radio, or drifting from a neighbor's window. Even as a toddler, Emma would become completely still when music played, her attention focused entirely on the sounds, her small body sometimes moving in rhythm without any conscious awareness. Now, as Emma sat backstage waiting for her turn to perform, she could hear the muffled sounds of the current performance filtering through the heavy curtains. A group of fifth graders was performing a pop song medley with enthusiastic but slightly off-key singing and energetic choreography that drew applause and laughter from the audience. The crowd clearly enjoyed the familiar songs and the children's obvious excitement, clapping along with the music and cheering when the performance ended. Linda glanced at the program printed on cheap paper and saw that Emma was scheduled to perform fifth on the list, right after a 9-year-old boy named Tyler who would be doing a magic act. She felt her own stomach tighten with nervousness, perhaps even more anxious than her daughter appeared to be. Linda knew that some people in their community had questioned their decision to let Emma perform such a challenging classical piece at a casual talent show. At the last neighborhood gathering, another mother had made a pointed comment about not wanting to see children set up for failure or embarrassment, suggesting that Emma should choose something more appropriate for her age and for the informal nature of the event. The words had stung, and Linda had spent several sleepless nights wondering if they were making a mistake, if they were pushing Emma too hard, if the performance would end in humiliation rather than triumph. But each time she had voiced these concerns to David, he had reminded her that this was Emma's choice, that their daughter had specifically asked to perform this piece, that Mrs. Kowalski supported the decision, and that they should trust their daughter's judgment and abilities. David was somewhere in the audience now, camera ready, having arrived 30 minutes early to secure a good seat with a clear view of the piano that would be rolled to center stage for instrumental performances. The instrument itself was a source of some concern. It was an older Yamaha upright that the community center owned, and while it was tuned regularly by a local technician, it lacked the responsiveness and tonal quality of the superior piano Emma practiced on at Mrs. Kowalski's studio. During the brief rehearsal that afternoon, when performers were allowed to check the stage and test any equipment they needed, Emma had played through a few measures and noted the slight stiffness in some of the keys and the way certain notes didn't sustain quite as long as she was used to. The action felt heavier, requiring more finger pressure to produce the same volume she could achieve with a lighter touch on Mrs. Kowalski's instrument. Mrs. Kowalski, who had accompanied the Chen family to the rehearsal, had assured Emma that she could adapt, reminding her that truly skilled musicians learn to work with whatever instrument they're given, whether it's a magnificent concert grand or a humble upright in a community center. The teacher's words had been comforting, and Emma had nodded her understanding. But now, in these final minutes before her performance, she felt the first real flutter of nerves in her chest. She had performed in several student recitals before, playing for audiences of parents and fellow students who came specifically to hear classical piano music, who understood the context and appreciated the technical challenges involved. But this was different. This was a community talent show with a much larger and more diverse audience, people who hadn't necessarily come to hear classical piano, people who might be expecting something more contemporary or entertaining, people who might not understand or appreciate what she was attempting to do. The magic act finished to enthusiastic applause and laughter, and Mr. Patterson's voice boomed through the sound system once again, making jokes about rabbits and hats as the young magician took his bows and exited the stage to continued applause. A stagehand, a teenage volunteer from the local high school, quickly checked the piano that had been positioned on stage, adjusting the bench slightly and wiping down the keys with a soft cloth to remove any dust or fingerprints. Linda helped Emma stand, her own hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the wrinkles from her daughter's dress and adjusted the white ribbon in her hair one final time. She kissed Emma's forehead and whispered that she loved her, that she was so proud of her no matter what happened out there, that all she needed to do was play the way she had played at home and in her lessons. Emma nodded, clutching her folder of sheet music even though she wouldn't need it. Even though she had played this piece so many times that it lived in her fingers and her heart more than on any printed page. As she walked toward the stage entrance, her small shoes making soft clicking sounds on the floor that seemed loud in her own ears. She heard Mr. Patterson begin her introduction. His cheerful voice announced that the next performer would be playing a classical piece on the piano, and that everyone should give a warm welcome to 7-year-old Emma Chen, who would be performing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Emma took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped through the curtain into the bright lights of the stage. Emma walked onto the stage with careful steps, her small figure seeming even tinier under the bright stage lights that made the audience beyond the first few rows difficult to see clearly. The applause that greeted her entrance was polite, but notably less enthusiastic than what had followed the previous performers. A scattered clapping that died away quickly as people settled back into their seats. She made her way to the piano bench, her music folder still clutched in her small hands, and the massive upright piano seemed to tower over her diminutive frame. As she approached the instrument, she could hear whispers beginning to ripple through the audience, voices that weren't bothering to keep their volume particularly low. From somewhere in the middle section of seats, a woman's voice carried clearly to the stage, asking her companion in a tone of disbelief mixed with amusement whether they were really expected to sit through a classical music performance. Another voice, male this time, responded with a comment about how these talent shows were supposed to be fun and entertaining, not boring recitals. Emma tried to focus on the piano bench, adjusting its height the way Mrs. Kowalski had taught her, making sure she could reach the pedals comfortably and that her arms had the correct angle to the keyboard. But the whispers were growing louder, becoming actual conversations now as people apparently decided that a 7-year-old preparing to play classical piano wasn't worth their attention or respect. Emma carefully placed her music folder on the piano's music stand, even though she knew she wouldn't need to look at it, and smoothed her dress beneath her as she sat on the bench. The whispers had now become open talking, with several conversations happening simultaneously throughout the theater. She could hear someone's phone ringing, the electronic chirp loud and jarring in what should have been a respectful silence. Someone else was discussing weekend plans with enough volume that their words carried easily to the stage. Emma glanced toward the wings where she knew her mother was standing, and even through the bright lights, she could see Linda's form in the shadows, could imagine the worried expression on her mother's face. Mr. Patterson, still standing at the side of the stage with his microphone, attempted to quiet the audience with a gentle reminder that the performance was about to begin. His words had minimal effect. A few people in the front rows stopped talking, but the disruption continued unabated in the back and middle sections of the theater. Emma placed her hands on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingers, trying to center herself the way Mrs. Kowalski had taught her, focusing on the music she was about to share rather than the chaos around her. She closed her eyes for just a moment, preparing to play the opening notes, and that's when the first shout came. "Get off the stage." The voice was male, coming from somewhere toward the back of the theater, loud enough that there was no possibility of mistaking the words or pretending they hadn't been spoken. The command was followed immediately by laughter, multiple voices joining in amusement at the cruel comment. Emma's hands froze on the keys, her eyes opening wide with shock. She had never experienced anything like this before. In her limited performance experience, audiences had always been respectful, even if they weren't particularly engaged. This outright hostility was something she had no preparation for, no way to process or respond to. "Yeah, play something we actually want to hear," another voice called out, this time from a different section of the audience. More laughter followed, and now others were emboldened to join in with their own comments. Someone shouted that this was supposed to be a fun talent show, not a classical music concert. Another voice, sounding annoyed, complained about having to sit through boring piano music when they had come to see their own child perform later in the program. The comments kept coming, overlapping each other, creating a wave of rejection and mockery that washed over the small girl sitting alone at the piano. Emma's hands trembled on the keys, and she pulled them back into her lap, clutching them together as if she could physically hold onto her composure. Her face, which had been calm and focused when she first walked onto the stage, now showed clear distress. Her dark eyes glistened with the beginning of tears, and her lower lip quivered despite her efforts to maintain control. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could hear the rush of blood in her ears competing with the cruel voices coming from the darkness beyond the stage lights. Every instinct in her 7-year-old body told her to run, to flee from this nightmare, to escape back through the curtain to her mother's protective embrace. In the wings, Linda stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, her own eyes filling with tears as she watched her daughter being verbally assaulted by people who should have known better. Adults who were modeling cruelty rather than kindness for the children present. She wanted desperately to rush onto the stage, to sweep Emma into her arms and carry her away from this horrible situation, to shield her from the ugliness of people who couldn't see past their own expectations and prejudices. But something held her back, perhaps the knowledge that Emma needed to make her own choice about what to do next, or perhaps simply the paralysis that comes from witnessing your child in pain and being powerless to stop it. Mr. Patterson finally found his voice and attempted to take control of the situation, speaking firmly into his microphone and asking the audience to show respect for all performers regardless of their age or choice of material. His words carried authority, and for a moment the hostile comments stopped. But the damage had been done. The atmosphere in the theater had transformed from casually dismissive to actively antagonistic. Even those audience members who hadn't participated in the heckling sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether the performance would continue or whether the little girl would simply leave the stage in tears. David, sitting in the fifth row with his camera ready, felt rage and heartbreak warring in his chest. He wanted to stand up and confront the people who had shouted at his daughter, to demand they apologize, to shame them for their cruelty toward a child. But he also knew that creating more of a scene wouldn't help Emma. Instead, he remained in his seat, his hands gripping his camera so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, his eyes fixed on his daughter's small figure at the piano, silently willing her to find the strength to either play or to walk off with her dignity intact. Mrs. Kowalski, standing at the very back of the theater, where she had positioned herself to hear how Emma's performance would sound from the worst acoustic position in the room, felt tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. In her 40 years of teaching, she had never witnessed such disrespect shown to a student performer. She had sent countless students to various competitions, recitals, and performances, and while she had seen nervousness, mistakes, and even performances that didn't go as planned, she had never seen an audience actively try to prevent a child from performing. Part of her wondered if this was somehow her fault, if she had made a mistake in allowing Emma to choose such an ambitious piece for this venue, if she had set her beloved student up for this humiliation. The stage manager, a community center employee named Sarah who had helped run this talent show for the past 5 years, stood in the opposite wing from Linda, her hand on the curtain control, ready to close the curtains if Emma couldn't continue. She had her other hand on her radio, ready to call for Mr. Patterson to announce an intermission or to skip ahead to the next performer. She watched Emma carefully, trying to read the child's body language, ready to intervene if necessary, but also hoping that somehow this situation could be salvaged. The silence that followed Mr. Patterson's request for respect lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though it felt much longer to everyone involved. In that silence, Emma sat motionless at the piano, her hands still clasped in her lap, her head bowed slightly as if in defeat. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps feeling guilty about what had transpired, perhaps simply wanting this awkward moment to end one way or another. A few people in the back were still whispering, though more quietly now, their comments inaudible from the stage, but their attitudes clearly unchanged by Mr. Patterson's intervention. Then from the middle section where much of the heckling had originated came another voice, this time a woman who apparently felt no shame about her opinion. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said loudly enough for much of the theater to hear, "can we just move on to something entertaining? Nobody wants to hear a kid play classical music at a talent show. This isn't Carnegie Hall." Her comment was met with some scattered laughter and a few murmurs of agreement, and it seemed to be the final straw that would send Emma running from the stage in tears. Emma's head came up at those words and something shifted in her expression. The fear and hurt were still there, visible in her glistening eyes and trembling chin, but now there was something else as well, something that looked almost like determination. She turned her head slightly toward the wings where her mother stood, and their eyes met across the distance. Linda, seeing her daughter look to her for guidance or permission or perhaps just connection, made a small gesture with her hand, a movement that might have meant "come here" or might have meant "it's your choice" or might have simply been an expression of love and support that transcended specific meaning. Emma sat frozen at the piano bench, the weight of the moment pressing down on her small shoulders with an almost physical force. The cruel words echoed in her mind, mixing with the sound of her own heartbeat that seemed impossibly loud in her ears. She could feel tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, could feel her throat tightening with the effort of holding back sobs, could feel every cell in her body urging her to run away from this nightmare situation. Her hands, still clasped tightly in her lap, were trembling visibly now, and she wondered if anyone in the audience could see how badly she was shaking, how close she was to complete collapse. The stage lights felt hot on her face, and she became acutely aware of how exposed she was, sitting alone on this elevated platform with hundreds of eyes watching her, judging her, many of them clearly wishing she would simply disappear so they could move on to something they considered more entertaining. She thought about all the other times she had performed, the comfortable recitals in Mrs. Kowalski's studio, where everyone present loved classical music and understood the effort required to master pieces like the one she had prepared. Those performances had been challenging but ultimately safe, surrounded by people who wanted her to succeed. This was entirely different. This was hostile territory, and she was completely alone. Emma's eyes found her mother again in the wings, and she saw Linda's face clearly now, saw the tears streaming down her mother's cheeks, saw the mixture of love and anguish in her expression. In that moment, Emma understood that whatever she decided to do next, her mother would support her. If she stood up and walked off the stage right now, Linda would be there with open arms to hold her and comfort her and tell her that she had done nothing wrong, that the fault lay entirely with the cruel people in the audience. The thought was tempting, so tempting that Emma actually shifted her weight slightly on the bench, preparing to stand, preparing to end this humiliation and seek the safety of her mother's embrace. But then another image came to her mind. The memory of Mrs. Kowalski sitting beside her at the piano during one of their lessons several months ago, when Emma was struggling with a particularly difficult passage of the Moonlight Sonata. The elderly teacher had placed her weathered hand over Emma's small one and said something that Emma had written in her practice journal and read many times since. Mrs. Kowalski had told her that music was one of humanity's greatest gifts, a way of communicating emotions and experiences that transcended words, that crossed barriers of language and culture and age. She had explained that when you truly understood a piece of music, when you connected with it deeply enough, you had a responsibility to share it with others, because in doing so you were offering them a gift, the opportunity to experience something beautiful and meaningful that might touch their hearts and perhaps even change them in some small way. At the time, Emma hadn't fully grasped what her teacher meant. She had nodded and continued practicing, focused on the technical challenges of getting her fingers to play the right notes at the right time with the right dynamics. But now, sitting on this stage facing open hostility, the words suddenly made perfect sense. She had spent 6 months learning this piece, not just memorizing the notes but truly understanding it, feeling Beethoven's emotions flowing through her as she played, connecting with the profound sadness and beauty that the composer had poured into this music more than 200 years ago. She had worked so hard, practiced so many hours, overcome so many technical obstacles, and she had done it all because the music meant something to her, because it spoke to something deep inside her that had no other voice. The people in the audience who had shouted at her, who had laughed and mocked and told her to get off the stage, they didn't understand yet. They didn't know what she was capable of, didn't know what she had prepared to share with them. They had judged her based on her age and her choice of material and their own limited expectations, but they hadn't actually heard her play. They hadn't given her a chance. And suddenly, with a clarity that surprised her given her young age and limited life experience, Emma realized that if she walked off this stage now, those people would never know what they had missed. They would go home thinking they had been right to dismiss her, right to mock a 7-year-old girl for attempting something they considered above her capabilities or inappropriate for the venue. Emma thought about her father sitting somewhere in the audience, and she knew without seeing him that he was probably fighting back tears of his own, probably struggling with the desire to confront the people who had been cruel to his daughter. She thought about her brother Michael, who had complained about her endless practicing but who had also started sitting near the living room to hear her play, who had once told her that her piano playing was actually pretty cool even though he'd never admit it to his friends. She thought about her grandmother who had pressed her dress so carefully that morning, who had smiled with pride when Emma told her about the performance, who had told stories about Emma's mother learning to play the guzheng as a child in Taiwan, practicing for hours despite the difficulty, never giving up even when her fingers hurt and the music seemed impossibly complex. The memory of her grandmother's stories triggered another realization. Emma's family had come to America seeking better opportunities, leaving behind everything familiar to build a new life in a foreign country. Her parents had faced countless challenges, moments when people had dismissed them or underestimated them because of their accents or their appearance or their immigrant status. But they had persevered, had worked incredibly hard, had refused to be defined by other people's limited expectations. If they could find the courage to build an entire life in a new country despite facing obstacles and prejudice, surely she could find the courage to play one piano piece despite facing a hostile audience. The silence in the theater had stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. Mr. Patterson stood uncertainly at the side of the stage, his microphone held loosely in his hand, clearly unsure whether to say something else or wait to see what Emma would do. The stage manager Sarah had taken a step closer to the curtain controls, ready to close them if Emma broke down completely. In the audience, some people were still whispering, while others sat in uncomfortable silence, perhaps beginning to feel ashamed of their behavior or at least aware that they were witnessing a child in distress. Emma took a deep breath, the kind of centering breath that Mrs. Kowalski had taught her to take before beginning any performance. She felt the air fill her lungs, felt her racing heartbeat begin to slow just slightly, felt some of the panic that had been threatening to overwhelm her start to recede. She unclenched her hands and placed them gently on her lap, looking down at her fingers, these small hands that had worked so hard to master the complex movements required by Beethoven's masterpiece. These hands knew what to do. They had played through this piece hundreds of times. They understood the music in a way that transcended conscious thought. She could trust them. Slowly, deliberately, Emma raised her hands from her lap and placed them on the piano keys, finding the correct starting position by feel and long practice. The keys felt cool beneath her fingertips, and the familiar sensation was comforting, grounding her in the present moment. She was no longer just a frightened 7-year-old being mocked by cruel adults. She was a musician preparing to perform a piece she loved, a piece she had earned the right to play through months of dedicated work. Whatever happened next, whatever the audience's response might be, she would know that she had found the courage to try, that she hadn't let fear and cruelty silence her. Emma glanced one more time toward the wings, and this time when she met her mother's eyes, she saw Linda nodding, saw her mother's hand pressed to her heart in a gesture of love and encouragement. She looked out toward the audience, toward the darkness beyond the stage lights where her father sat with his camera ready, where Mrs. Kowalski stood at the back of the theater, where hundreds of people waited with various degrees of anticipation or skepticism or outright hostility to see what would happen next. She knew that some of them wanted her to fail, wanted to be proven right in their judgment that she shouldn't be attempting this performance. But she also knew that somewhere in that darkness were people who were willing to listen, willing to give her a chance, willing to be moved by music if she could play it well enough. The decision crystallized in that moment. Emma closed her eyes, shutting out the stage lights and the whispers and the memory of the cruel shouts that had nearly driven her from the stage. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she found the music waiting for her, the opening measures of the Moonlight Sonata that she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. She could hear it in her mind, the gentle triplet rhythm that gave the piece its flowing, water-like quality, the haunting melody that would emerge from those rippling notes like moonlight breaking through clouds. The fear was still there, fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird, but it no longer controlled her. She had made her choice. Emma took one more deep breath and positioned her fingers precisely on the keys, her right hand ready to play the flowing accompaniment pattern, her left hand prepared to add the bass notes that would anchor the harmony. She felt her foot find the damper pedal, ready to create the sustained, ethereal sound that this piece required. Everything was in place. She had practiced for this moment, prepared for it, dreamed about it. The audience's hostility had nearly stolen it from her, but she was taking it back. She was going to play, and she was going to play beautifully, and whatever happened after that would happen. But she would know that she had been brave, that she had chosen courage over fear, that she had given the music the chance it deserved to speak to whoever was willing to listen. In the wings, Linda saw the change in her daughter's posture, saw Emma's shoulders straighten and her head lift with quiet determination, and she felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, but these were different tears. Tears of pride and wonder at this remarkable child who was finding courage that many adults would struggle to summon. In the audience, David leaned forward in his seat, his camera forgotten for the moment, his entire being focused on his daughter, silently sending every ounce of love and support he possessed across the distance that separated them. At the back of the theater, Mrs. Kowalski clasped her hands together and closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer that Emma would find the strength to do what she had trained so hard to do. The moment hung suspended, precious and fragile, as Emma sat at the piano with her eyes closed and her hands on the keys, poised between the safety of retreat and the risk of continuing. And then, with a courage that would be remembered and talked about for years to come, she pressed down on the first notes and began to play. The opening triplet of the Moonlight Sonata emerged from the piano with a clarity and gentleness that seemed impossible given the chaos that had preceded it. Emma's right hand moved in the characteristic rolling pattern that Beethoven had created to evoke the image of moonlight shimmering on water. Each note precisely placed, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. The sound was soft, almost tentative, as if the music itself was uncertain of its welcome in this hostile space. But there was also something compelling about those first notes, a quality that immediately commanded attention in a way that no amount of shouting or demanding silence could have achieved. The effect on the audience was not instantaneous, but it was inexorable. The first few measures floated out into the theater while several people were still whispering, still convinced that this would be a tedious performance they would have to endure. But as Emma's left hand entered with the deep bass notes that provided harmonic foundation, as the melody began to emerge from the accompaniment pattern like a voice rising from darkness, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. One by one, the whispered conversations faltered and stopped. People who had been looking at their phones or talking to their neighbors found their attention drawn almost against their will to the small figure at the piano. Emma kept her eyes closed as she played, shutting out everything except the music flowing through her fingers. She was no longer thinking about the audience or their earlier hostility or her own fear and humiliation. She had entered that particular state of consciousness that musicians sometimes achieve when they're completely absorbed in performance, where technical execution becomes automatic, and the performer becomes a channel for the music rather than someone consciously controlling it. Her hands moved across the keys with a grace and precision that belied her age, finding each note exactly where it needed to be, shaping each phrase with the kind of musical intelligence that usually required years more experience than she possessed. The rolling triplet pattern continued, hypnotic and mesmerizing, and now even those who had been most vocal in their dismissal of Emma's performance found themselves falling silent. There was something about the quality of her playing that defied their expectations and assumptions. This wasn't a child mechanically reproducing notes she had memorized. This was music making of a remarkably high caliber, with attention to dynamics and phrasing and tonal color that revealed genuine artistic sensibility. The piece was still in its opening section, still establishing the mood and texture that would support the entire first movement, but already it was clear that something special was happening on that stage. In the fifth row, David finally remembered to raise his camera and begin recording, though his hands were shaking so badly that he had to take a moment to steady himself. Through the viewfinder, he watched his daughter's profile, saw her face peaceful now, concentrated but no longer showing the fear and hurt that had been so visible moments before. She looked almost serene, lost in the music, and he felt his heart swell with a pride so intense it was almost painful. This was his daughter, this brave and talented little girl who had been shouted at and mocked and had somehow found the strength to not only continue, but to play with this level of beauty and emotional depth. At the back of the theater, Mrs. Kowalski stood with tears streaming freely down her face, no longer even attempting to wipe them away. She had known Emma was ready for this piece, had believed in her students' ability to perform it competently, but what she was hearing now exceeded her expectations. Emma wasn't just playing the notes correctly, she was truly inhabiting the music, understanding its emotional content and communicating it through every carefully shaped phrase. The old teacher had heard the Moonlight Sonata performed hundreds of times over her long career, by students and professionals alike. And while this performance didn't have the technical polish of a concert pianist, it had something that many more advanced performances lacked: absolute sincerity and emotional honesty. The melody line emerged more clearly now, Beethoven's gorgeous, melancholy tune that seemed to speak of longing and loss and quiet sadness. Emma's right hand carried this melody while simultaneously maintaining the accompaniment pattern, a technical challenge that required complete independence between the fingers, and she executed it with remarkable control. Her use of the pedal was particularly impressive, sustaining the harmonies without allowing the sound to become muddy or unclear, creating the ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere that this piece required. Every dynamic marking, every subtle crescendo and diminuendo, every slight rubato that added expressive flexibility to the rhythm, all of it was thoughtfully executed and musically justified. Around the theater, audience members who had come expecting nothing more than casual entertainment found themselves drawn into something they hadn't anticipated. Parents who had brought their children to perform simple talent show acts were experiencing a genuine artistic performance, and many of them didn't quite know how to process what they were hearing. Some leaned forward in their seats, completely absorbed. Others sat back with expressions of wonder or surprise or even confusion, as if they couldn't quite reconcile the sophisticated music they were hearing with the tiny child producing it. A few people, particularly those who had been most vocal in their earlier hostility, sat with uncomfortable expressions, perhaps beginning to realize the enormity of their mistake, the cruelty of trying to silence this remarkable young performer before she'd even had a chance to show what she could do. Emma moved through the opening section and into the first full statement of the main theme, and here the piece demanded even more emotional expression. Her playing took on additional depth, each phrase shaped with careful attention to its place in the larger musical structure. She was telling a story through this music, communicating Beethoven's artistic vision across more than 2 centuries, and she was doing it with a maturity that seemed to transcend her 7 years of life. Whether she fully understood the adult emotions this music expressed, the romantic longing and melancholy that Beethoven had poured into it, was perhaps questionable, but she didn't need to understand it intellectually. She felt it intuitively, responded to it emotionally, and that authenticity came through in every note she played. The transformation in the room was now complete. The scattered whispers and conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so profound that the piano seemed to be the only sound in the universe. People barely seemed to be breathing, afraid that any noise might break the spell that Emma's playing had cast over the theater. The hostile atmosphere that had driven her nearly to tears just minutes before had been completely replaced by something approaching reverence. Even the children in the audience, many of whom might typically have been fidgeting or bored by classical music, sat unusually still, responsive to something in Emma's performance that transcended their usual preferences and preconceptions. Mr. Patterson, still standing in the wings with his microphone, had lowered his hand to his side and was watching Emma with an expression of amazement. He had hosted this talent show for 7 years and had seen hundreds of young performers, some quite talented, some earnestly doing their best despite limited abilities. But he had never witnessed anything like this. He found himself thinking that he would remember this performance for the rest of his life, that he was witnessing one of those rare moments when something truly extraordinary happens in an unexpected place and time. Sarah, the stage manager, had moved away from the curtain controls and now stood transfixed, her responsibilities temporarily forgotten in the face of Emma's performance. She had been prepared to end this disaster moments ago, to spare the poor child further humiliation by closing the curtains and moving on to the next act. Now she was grateful that she hadn't had to make that decision, that Emma had found the courage to begin playing, because this was clearly something special, something that deserved to be witnessed and remembered. The music continued to unfold, measure after measure of Beethoven's genius, interpreted through the mind and heart and hands of a 7-year-old girl who had somehow found a way to connect with it deeply enough to make it her own. Emma's body swayed slightly with the music, a natural physical response to the emotional content she was expressing, and this physical engagement added another layer of authenticity to her performance. She wasn't stiff or mechanical. She was alive with the music, letting it flow through her entire being, not just her fingers. As the first major section of the piece drew toward its close and prepared to transition into the next section, Emma demonstrated her understanding of musical architecture by subtly adjusting her dynamics and tempo, creating a sense of arrival, and then gently leading the listener forward into what would come next. These were sophisticated interpretive choices, the kind of decisions that typically required considerable musical education and experience to make effectively, yet Emma was making them instinctively, guided by her deep familiarity with the piece and her natural musical intelligence. In the audience, people were beginning to realize that they were witnessing something they would talk about for years to come, a performance that transcended the casual nature of a community talent show and touched something universal about human courage and artistic expression. The woman who had made the sarcastic comment about Carnegie Hall sat with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears rolling down her cheeks, mortified by her earlier cruelty and moved by the extraordinary music this child was producing. The man who had shouted for Emma to get off the stage sat hunched in his seat, his face burning with shame, unable to believe that he had tried to silence something so beautiful before it had even begun. Throughout the theater, similar scenes were playing out as the reality of Emma's extraordinary talent and the ugliness of the audience's initial response collided in people's consciousness. Some cried openly, moved by both the music and their own shame. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to fully process what they were experiencing. A few smiled through their tears, simply grateful to be present for this unexpected gift of beauty and courage. And Emma played on, unaware of the emotional transformation she was creating in her audience, focused entirely on the music she was sharing, giving everything she had to Beethoven's masterpiece, honoring both the composer and her own months of dedicated preparation. The music filled every corner of the small theater, the gorgeous melody soaring over the steady accompaniment, creating an atmosphere of profound emotion and beauty that made the worn velvet seats and faded curtains and scuffed stage floor irrelevant. For these moments, the community center had become a concert hall, and a 7-year-old girl was reminding everyone present of music's power to transform hearts and transcend circumstances, and reveal the extraordinary that can exist within the ordinary. Emma moved deeper into the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, and with each passing phrase, her confidence seemed to grow. The initial terror that had nearly paralyzed her had been transformed by the act of playing into something approaching serenity. Her fingers moved across the keys with increasing assurance, navigating the technical challenges of the piece with a combination of careful preparation and intuitive musicality that would have been impressive in a performer twice her age. The rolling triplet pattern that characterized this movement continued without interruption, steady as waves on a moonlit shore, while the melody wove through it like a silver thread through dark fabric. The piece began to reveal its full emotional complexity as Emma progressed through the development section. Beethoven had structured this sonata in an unusual way, beginning with a slow, deeply expressive movement instead of the fast, energetic opening that was more typical of classical sonatas. This first movement was marked adagio sostenuto, meaning it should be played slowly and sustained, and Emma honored this instruction perfectly. She didn't rush through difficult passages or hesitate before challenging finger positions. Instead, she maintained a steady, contemplative tempo that allowed every note to speak clearly, every harmony to resonate fully, every melodic phrase to develop and resolve with natural grace. As the music moved through its various harmonic territories, shifting from the home key into related keys and back again, Emma demonstrated her understanding of the piece's emotional arc. She subtly adjusted her dynamics to highlight these harmonic changes, growing slightly louder as the music moved into brighter keys, pulling back when it returned to the darker, more melancholic tonalities. These weren't changes she was making from conscious analysis. They flowed naturally from her deep familiarity with the piece and her intuitive sense of musical expression. Mrs. Kowalski had spent considerable time discussing the harmonic structure with Emma, helping her understand how Beethoven used key changes to create emotional effects. And that teaching was bearing fruit now in the thoughtful way Emma shaped each section. The technical demands of the piece were considerable, particularly for small hands. The left hand had to span wide intervals to reach the bass notes that anchored each measure, while the right hand had to maintain perfect independence between the fingers carrying the melody and those sustaining the accompaniment pattern. There were moments where the spacing of the notes made it physically challenging for Emma's small hands to reach everything comfortably, and during her months of practice, she had worked with Mrs. Kowalski to find solutions, sometimes slightly adjust. The music reached one of its most beautiful passages, where the melody ascended into the higher register of the piano, the notes clear and bell-like, while the accompaniment pattern continued its steady flow beneath. Emma's touch was particularly delicate here, coaxing a beautiful singing tone from the piano despite its age and limitations. She used the pedal with great subtlety, creating just enough resonance to connect the notes without blurring them together. The effect was ethereal, otherworldly, exactly the quality this piece required. In the audience, several people sat with their eyes closed, simply absorbing the sound, letting it wash over them like water or light. Mrs. Kowalski, listening with the trained ear of a lifelong professional musician, was analyzing Emma's performance even as she was moved by it emotionally. She noted the consistent tempo, the careful attention to Beethoven's dynamic markings, the thoughtful phrasing that gave shape and direction to each musical sentence. She heard a few tiny imperfections, notes that weren't quite as even as they might have been, one or two places where the rhythm wasn't absolutely precise. But these small technical issues were completely overwhelmed by the overall quality of the interpretation. Emma was playing with genuine musical understanding, and that was infinitely more valuable than mere technical perfection. The old teacher had known many students who could play difficult pieces with impressive accuracy, but no real musical feeling. Emma was the opposite, a student whose technical skills were still developing but whose musical instincts were already profound. As the first movement progressed toward its climax, the emotional intensity of the music increased. The melody became more insistent, the harmonies more complex and chromatic, creating a sense of yearning and tension that would only be fully resolved in the final measures. Emma leaned into this emotional intensification, allowing her playing to become slightly more passionate without losing control or rushing the tempo. Her face, visible in profile to her mother and to some audience members on the sides of the theater, showed deep concentration but also something that looked almost like joy. Despite the frightening beginning to this performance, despite the cruelty she had faced just minutes ago, Emma was now doing exactly what she loved most in the world, playing beautiful music and sharing it with others. The transformation in the audience was complete and profound. These were many of the same people who, just a few minutes earlier, had been talking through Emma's entrance, checking their phones, making dismissive comments about classical music at a talent show. Now they sat in absolute stillness, many with tears streaming down their faces, completely absorbed in the performance. Parents who had brought their children to perform simple dance routines or pop songs were experiencing something they had never expected to encounter at a casual community event. Genuine artistry, the kind of performance that reminds you why music matters, why it has the power to move people across centuries and cultures and circumstances. A woman sitting in the 10th row, a middle school music teacher named Angela Martinez, found herself thinking that she would use this experience with her students. She would tell them about the 7-year-old girl who had been shouted at and mocked, who had nearly been driven from the stage in tears, but who had found the courage to play anyway, and in doing so had revealed not just her own extraordinary talent, but also the power of music to transform hostility into wonder, skepticism into appreciation, cruelty into shame, and ultimately perhaps into something like redemption. Angela had seen the people around her shouting at this child, and she had felt sickened by their behavior, had wanted to stand up and confront them. Now she watched those same people sitting transfixed by Emma's playing, and she hoped that they would carry this lesson forward, that they would remember this moment the next time they were tempted to dismiss someone based on age or appearance or preconceptions. The musical architecture of the first movement was approaching its final section now, where Beethoven would bring the listener back to the opening material, but with slight variations that acknowledged everything that had happened in between. Emma navigated this return beautifully, making it feel both familiar and fresh, like coming home after a journey and seeing familiar places with new eyes. Her dynamics were particularly effective here, pulling back to a softer volume that drew the listener in, creating a sense of intimacy and reflection. Throughout the theater, people were completely still, afraid to move or cough or make any sound that might disturb this extraordinary performance. Parents held their young children close, grateful that they were present to witness this moment. Teenagers who had come expecting to be bored found themselves unexpectedly moved, some experiencing classical music with genuine appreciation for the first time in their lives. Elderly audience members who had attended countless concerts and performances over their long lives recognized that they were witnessing something special, a performance that would live in memory long after many more technically perfect performances had been forgotten. Emma's brother Michael, sitting with his father in the fifth row, watched his little sister with an expression of wonder. He had heard her practice this piece hundreds of times, had sometimes found it annoying when he was trying to focus on homework or video games. But hearing it now in this context, seeing the effect it was having on all these people, he suddenly understood what Emma had been working toward all those months. He felt a surge of protective pride, and he found himself wishing he could confront every person who had shouted at his sister, who had tried to silence her before she could show them what she was capable of. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata was nearing its conclusion now, the final phrases bringing the piece full circle, returning to the opening mood of quiet melancholy, but now enriched by everything that had come before. Emma played these closing measures with particular tenderness, each note carefully placed, the dynamics pulling back to barely above a whisper. The rolling accompaniment pattern continued, steady and inexorable like the passage of time itself, and the melody floated above it like a memory or a dream. The music seemed to be saying something about the bittersweet nature of beauty, about how the most profound experiences are often tinged with sadness, about how we reach for something transcendent even while knowing it cannot last. As Emma approached the final pages of the first movement, the emotional weight of the piece seemed to intensify even further. Beethoven had crafted these closing sections with particular genius, layering melody and harmony in ways that created a profound sense of longing and resignation. The music wasn't dramatic in an obvious way. There were no sudden fortissimo outbursts or rapid passages designed to showcase technical virtuosity. Instead, the power came from the cumulative effect of the sustained mood, the way each phrase built on what had come before, creating an emotional landscape that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. Emma's understanding of this emotional architecture was evident in how she shaped these final sections. She allowed the music to breathe, giving each phrase room to develop and resolve naturally, never rushing toward the conclusion but letting it arrive in its own time. Her touch on the keys remained consistently beautiful, drawing a warm, singing tone from the piano even in the softest passages. The rolling triplet accompaniment that had characterized the entire movement continued without faltering, and the melody wove through it with increasing poignancy, as if Beethoven himself were speaking across the centuries about loss and beauty and the passage of time. In the audience, the emotional response to Emma's playing had grown beyond simple appreciation of musical skill. People were responding not just to the quality of her performance, but to the entire arc of what they had witnessed. The cruel rejection she had faced, the moment of decision when she could have fled but chose instead to play, and now this extraordinary music pouring from her small hands. The juxtaposition of her youth and vulnerability with the sophistication and emotional depth of her playing created a powerful effect that left many audience members struggling to contain their emotions. David's camera continued to record, but he was barely aware of it anymore. Tears streamed freely down his face, and he made no attempt to wipe them away. He was watching his daughter achieve something remarkable, but more than that, he was watching her demonstrate a kind of courage that he wasn't sure he possessed himself. He thought about the times in his own life when he had faced rejection or dismissal, moments when people had underestimated him or treated him with disrespect because of his accent or his immigrant status. He remembered how those experiences had hurt, how some of them still hurt years later. and he marveled that his 7-year-old daughter had faced similar cruelty tonight, and had somehow found the strength not just to continue, but to excel, to transform her audience's hostility into something approaching reverence through the sheer beauty and sincerity of her artistry. Linda, still standing in the wings, had her hand pressed to her heart, feeling it beat in rhythm with the music her daughter was creating. She thought about the first time Emma had sat at a piano, barely able to reach the keys even with her arms stretched up, plinking out random notes with delighted curiosity. She remembered Emma's first lesson with Mrs. Kowalski, how nervous Linda had been about whether this teacher would be patient enough with such a young student, how those fears had dissolved within minutes as she watched the elderly Polish woman and the tiny Chinese-American girl connect through their shared love of music. She thought about all the sacrifices the family had made to support Emma's musical education, not just the financial cost of lessons and sheet music, but the time and energy and household reorganization required to accommodate hours of daily practice. And now, watching her daughter transform a roomful of initially hostile strangers through the power of her playing, Linda felt that every sacrifice had been worth it 1,000 times over. Mrs. Kowalski at the back of the theater was experiencing emotions that surprised her with their intensity. She had taught hundreds of students over her 4 decades as a piano teacher, and she had loved many of them, had taken pride in their accomplishments and felt disappointment at their setbacks. But Emma was special in a way that the old teacher had rarely encountered. It wasn't just Emma's talent, though that was considerable. It was the combination of talent and dedication and emotional intelligence, the way Emma approached music with complete sincerity and openness, without the ego or self-consciousness that often hindered more technically advanced students. Mrs. Kowalski had known from early in Emma's studies that this child had the potential to become a serious musician if she chose that path. But tonight was revealing something even more rare. Emma possessed not just the ability to play music beautifully, but the courage to share it even in the face of active hostility. And that combination of vulnerability and strength was what separated true artists from mere technicians. The music moved into its final phrases, and Emma's playing took on an almost transcendent quality. The melody seemed to float in the air, sustained by the pedal and by the careful balance of sound she was creating, while the accompaniment pattern beneath it provided steady support. These last measures were marked sempre pianissimo, always very soft, and Emma honored this instruction perfectly, pulling the volume back until the music was barely above a whisper, forcing the audience to lean in and listen intently to catch every note. The effect was magical, creating an intimacy between performer and listeners that made the theater feel much smaller than it was, as if Emma were playing privately for each individual person in the room. Throughout the audience, people were experiencing this music in ways they never had before. For some, this was their first real exposure to classical music, and they were discovering that it could be accessible and moving rather than intimidating or boring. For others who had heard the Moonlight Sonata many times before, this performance was revealing something new about the piece, reminding them that familiarity doesn't have to breed indifference, that great music can continue to move us no matter how many times we encounter it. And for everyone present, regardless of their musical background or preferences, Emma's performance was demonstrating something profound about human potential and courage, and the transformative power of art. The woman who had made the cruel comment about Carnegie Hall sat with her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She was a real estate agent named Patricia, a mother of 3 who generally considered herself a good person, someone who volunteered at her children's schools and donated to charity and tried to be kind to others. But tonight she had been casually cruel to a child, had mocked a 7-year-old's ambitions without a second thought. And now she was being forced to confront the ugliness of that action. The beautiful music filling the theater felt like both a gift and a judgment, reminding her that she had nearly prevented it from being heard, that her thoughtless words had almost silenced something precious and rare. She would apologize to Emma after the performance, though she knew that no apology could truly erase what she had done. She would also, she vowed to herself, be more careful in the future about how she spoke to and about others, especially children, especially those who were attempting something brave and difficult. The man who had shouted for Emma to get off the stage, a contractor named Robert, sat hunched in his seat with his arms crossed tightly across his chest, his face burning with shame. He had come to the talent show because his daughter was performing a dance routine later in the program, and he had been in a bad mood already because of a difficult day at work. When Emma had walked onto the stage and he had seen that she was going to play classical music, something he had always dismissed as pretentious and boring, he had reacted with anger rather than patience, had lashed out at a child who had done nothing to deserve his hostility. Now, listening to her play with such beauty and skill, he felt mortified by his own behavior. His daughter, sitting beside him, had heard him shout at Emma, and he wondered what lesson he had just taught her about how to treat others, about how to respond when presented with something unfamiliar or challenging. He made a mental note to talk with his daughter after the show, to explicitly acknowledge that what he had done was wrong, that Emma had deserved better from him and from everyone else in the theater. Angela Martinez, the music teacher in the 10th row, was recording the audio on her phone, wanting to capture this performance so she could share it with her students. But more than that, she was simply absorbing the experience, letting it fill her with renewed faith in music's power and importance. She had been teaching middle school music for 15 years, and like many teachers, she sometimes struggled with burnout and discouragement, especially when budget cuts threatened her program or when students seemed more interested in their phones than in learning about rhythm or melody or harmony. But witnessing Emma's performance tonight, seeing how this young girl's courage and artistry had transformed a hostile audience into a moved and appreciative one, Angela felt her passion for music education rekindled. This was why it mattered, why arts education was essential rather than optional, why every child deserved the chance to discover their own potential for creativity and expression. Emma, unaware of the individual transformations happening throughout the audience, continued to pour everything she had into these final measures. The music was approaching its last cadence, the final harmonic resolution that would bring the first movement to its close. She shaped these concluding phrases with exquisite care, allowing the melody to descend gently while the accompaniment pattern finally came to rest after its long journey. The last notes hung in the air, suspended by the pedal slowly fading until the sound dissolved into complete silence. Emma kept her hands on the keys for a moment after the sound had completely died away, maintaining the mood, not wanting to break the spell too quickly. Her eyes were still closed, her face peaceful, and in that moment she looked both very young and somehow ageless, a child who had just channeled something much larger than herself. For several seconds after the final notes faded into silence, the theater remained absolutely still. No one moved, no one coughed, no one even seemed to breathe. It was as if the entire audience was suspended in the moment, unwilling to let it end, trying to hold on to the beauty and emotion of what they had just experienced. Emma sat at the piano with her hands still resting lightly on the keys, her eyes closed, her expression serene. She was caught in that particular space that sometimes exists at the end of a deeply felt performance, where the boundary between the music and the performer hasn't yet fully re-established itself, where she was still partly living inside Beethoven's composition rather than entirely back in her own consciousness. Then from somewhere in the middle of the theater, a single person began to clap. The applause started softly, almost tentatively, as if the person wasn't quite sure it was appropriate to break the profound silence. But within seconds, others joined in, and the sound grew rapidly from scattered clapping to thunderous applause that seemed to shake the walls of the small community theater. People rose to their feet, first in ones and twos, then in entire rows until the standing ovation was universal, every person in the theater on their feet, their hands coming together with such force that the sound was almost overwhelming. Emma's eyes opened at the first sound of applause, and for a moment she looked confused, as if she had forgotten where she was or that there was an audience present. She turned slightly on the bench to face the theater, and the sight that met her eyes was astonishing. Hundreds of people standing, clapping with an intensity that communicated not just appreciation but something deeper, something like gratitude or awe or perhaps redemption. Many were crying openly, tears streaming down their faces even as they applauded. Others were smiling with expressions of pure joy and wonder. Some were doing both, laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the emotional journey they had just experienced. Emma stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling slightly unsteady, and she remembered to bow the way Mrs. Kowalski had taught her, bending at the waist with her arms at her sides. The applause somehow grew even louder at this gesture, and shouts of bravo began to rise from various parts of the audience. Emma straightened from her bow, and now a shy smile began to appear on her face, the first smile she had shown since stepping onto the stage. The terror and hurt that had filled her expression earlier had been replaced by something that looked like a combination of surprise, relief, and quiet happiness. Mr. Patterson, still standing in the wings with his microphone, found himself clapping as hard as anyone in the audience, his earlier concerns about how to handle the hostile situation completely forgotten in the face of Emma's triumphant performance. He waited for the applause to begin subsiding, but it showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, as if the audience needed to physically express the emotions Emma's playing had stirred in them, and applause was the only outlet available. After nearly 2 full minutes of sustained ovation, Mr. Patterson finally stepped onto the stage, gently touching Emma's shoulder and gesturing for her to take another bow. Emma bowed again, and the audience's response was just as enthusiastic the second time. Linda emerged from the wings, unable to stay away any longer, and she hurried across the stage to embrace her daughter. The audience, seeing this reunion between mother and child, applauded even harder. Many people now openly sobbing at the sight of Linda wrapping Emma in her arms and holding her tightly while both of them cried. The image of the small girl in her navy blue dress being held by her mother, while hundreds of people stood and cheered, was one that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. David, still in the fifth row with his camera, finally stopped recording and began making his way toward the stage, pushing past other audience members who were also moving closer, wanting somehow to be nearer to the extraordinary young performer who had just moved them so deeply. Michael followed his father, his own eyes red from crying, his usual preteen coolness completely abandoned in the face of what his little sister had just accomplished. Other performers and their parents who had been waiting backstage emerged into the wings and then onto the stage itself, surrounding Emma with congratulations and amazement. Mrs. Kowalski remained at the back of the theater, still clapping, still crying, making no move to approach the stage. This was Emma's moment, and the old teacher was content to witness it from a distance, to watch her beloved student receive the recognition and appreciation she so richly deserved. Mrs. Kowalski had been teaching for over 4 decades, and she had known early in her career that moments like this were rare, that the combination of circumstances that had led to this extraordinary performance might never happen again in her lifetime. A student with Emma's unique blend of talent and dedication and courage, an audience that had been hostile and then transformed, a performance that had transcended mere technical accomplishment to become something truly memorable. All of these elements had come together in a way that felt almost miraculous. The applause continued for several more minutes, finally beginning to subside only when Mr. Patterson raised his microphone and asked the audience to please take their seats so the talent show could continue. People returned to their chairs reluctantly, still clapping, still calling out words of praise and encouragement to Emma. Linda guided her daughter off the stage and back into the wings, where they were immediately surrounded by other performers, parents, and community center staff, everyone wanting to congratulate Emma, to tell her how beautifully she had played, to express their amazement at her courage and skill. Patricia, the real estate agent who had made the cruel Carnegie Hall comment, was one of the first people to approach Linda and Emma backstage. Her face was blotchy from crying, and her voice shook as she spoke. She looked directly at Emma and apologized with obvious sincerity, telling the young girl that she had said something thoughtless and unkind, that she had been completely wrong, that Emma's performance had been one of the most beautiful things she had ever witnessed. Emma, with the generosity that came naturally to her gentle nature, simply nodded and said, "It's okay," though Linda's expression suggested that she was not quite as ready to forgive the woman who had hurt her daughter. Robert, the contractor who had shouted for Emma to get off the stage, approached next, bringing his daughter with him. He knelt down to Emma's eye level and told her that he had been very rude to her, that he had judged her unfairly, that she had just taught him an important lesson about not dismissing people before giving them a chance. His daughter, a girl of about 9 with her father's dark hair and eyes, added that Emma had played beautifully and that she wished she could play piano like that. Emma thanked them both quietly, still somewhat overwhelmed by everything that was happening. David finally reached his daughter, scooping her up in his arms despite the fact that she was getting a bit big to be carried easily. He held her tightly, whispering words in Mandarin and English about how proud he was, how brave she had been, how beautifully she had played. Michael, standing beside his father, reached out to touch his sister's arm, a gesture of affection that was unusual for him, and he told her with fierce pride that anyone who had shouted at her was an idiot and that she had shown them all. Angela Martinez, the music teacher, managed to make her way backstage to speak with Linda and Emma. She introduced herself and explained that she taught middle school music in a neighboring district. She told Emma that she had performed with genuine artistry, that her interpretation of the Moonlight Sonata had been thoughtful and mature, that she should be extremely proud of what she had accomplished. She asked Linda for permission to share the audio recording she had made with her students, explaining that she wanted to use Emma's performance as an example of courage and dedication and the power of music to transform hearts and situations. Linda, moved by the teacher's words, agreed immediately. The remainder of the talent show proceeded in an atmosphere that had been completely transformed from the casual, occasionally chaotic energy that had characterized the beginning of the evening. The audience, humbled and moved by what they had witnessed, treated every subsequent performer with respectful attention and enthusiastic applause, even when the acts were simple or the execution was imperfect. It was as if Emma's performance and her courage in the face of their own cruelty had taught them a collective lesson about the importance of supporting young people who were brave enough to perform, regardless of their skill level or choice of material. Parents whose children performed later in the show would comment in the weeks that followed that they had never seen such a supportive audience at a community talent event. The Chen family left the community center well after the show had ended, stopped repeatedly by people who wanted one more chance to congratulate Emma or to apologize for their earlier behavior. Emma handled this attention with quiet grace, though her exhaustion was becoming evident in the way she leaned against her mother and occasionally stifled yawns. They did indeed stop for ice cream on the way home, at a small shop that was technically closed but whose owner had been in the audience and insisted on opening back up to serve the remarkable young pianist a celebratory sundae. Emma ate her ice cream with the focused contentment of a child who had earned a special treat, seemingly unaware that her life had just changed in ways that would become clear only in the days and weeks ahead. The transformation began almost immediately, though the family didn't know it yet. Several people in the audience had recorded portions of Emma's performance on their phones, and that very night, before the Chen family had even arrived home from their ice cream stop, videos began appearing on social media. By morning, one particular video, recorded by a local small business owner with a surprisingly good camera phone, had been shared thousands of times. The video captured not just Emma's playing but also the hostile shouts from the audience at the beginning, her moment of frozen fear at the piano, and then the transformation as she began to play and the audience fell silent. This narrative arc from rejection to triumph proved irresistibly compelling to viewers. Within 48 hours, Emma's performance had gone viral in the truest sense of the word. The video had been shared millions of times across various social media platforms, and news outlets from local Cleveland stations to national networks were contacting the Chen family for interviews. Linda and David, overwhelmed and uncertain about how to handle the sudden attention, consulted with Mrs. Kowalski, who advised them to be selective about which interview requests they accepted, to prioritize Emma's well-being and normalcy over any opportunities for publicity or advancement that might come from this moment. The story that emerged in the media coverage touched something deep in the public consciousness. Here was a 7-year-old girl who had been cruelly dismissed and mocked, who had every reason to give up and run away, but who had instead found the courage to persist, and had transformed her detractors through the sheer beauty and sincerity of her artistry. In a world that often seemed dominated by negativity and cruelty, especially online, Emma's story offered a counter-narrative about courage and redemption and the power of persistence. Comment sections that typically devolved into arguments and insults were instead filled with messages of support for Emma and reflection about how quickly people judge others without giving them a fair chance. The week after the performance, Linda received a phone call from the director of a prestigious regional youth music festival that took place annually in Chicago. The director explained that she had seen the video of Emma's performance and been deeply moved, both by Emma's playing and by her courage. She wanted to invite Emma to perform at the festival in 3 months' time, an opportunity that would put her on stage with some of the most talented young musicians in the Midwest. Linda discussed the invitation with David and with Mrs. Kowalski, and after talking with Emma to make sure she would be comfortable with such a high-profile performance, they accepted. The media attention also brought some challenges. Several talent agents and music managers contacted the family, suggesting that Emma could have a lucrative career as a young performer, appearing on television shows and in commercials, perhaps recording an album. Mrs. Kowalski strongly advised against pursuing these opportunities, explaining that such early commercialization often damaged young musicians' development and love of music. She reminded Linda and David that Emma was 7 years old, that she should be allowed to develop naturally, to continue her education at a reasonable pace without the pressure and scrutiny that would come from being marketed as a child prodigy. The Chens agreed, politely declining the commercial opportunities while remaining open to genuine musical growth experiences like the Chicago Festival. At school, Emma suddenly found herself the center of attention in ways that made her uncomfortable. Classmates who had barely noticed her before now wanted to be her friend, and teachers treated her with a deference that felt strange. The school principal asked if Emma would perform at the next school assembly, an invitation that Emma declined through her parents, explaining that she needed some time to simply be a normal student rather than constantly performing. The principal, to his credit, understood and respected this boundary. Mrs. Kowalski noticed a significant change in Emma's playing in the lessons that followed the performance. Her young student had gained a new level of confidence and maturity, having proven to herself that she could perform under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. But Emma had also maintained her essential humility and dedication. She still approached each lesson with the same focus and commitment she had always shown, still practiced diligently every day, still listened carefully to her teacher's guidance. If anything, the experience had deepened Emma's love of music, rather than making her take it for granted or view it primarily as a path to recognition and praise. The impact on the Cleveland community was also significant. The community center that had hosted the talent show found itself becoming something of a landmark, with people stopping by to see where Emma's famous performance had taken place. The center's director, recognizing an opportunity, established a scholarship fund to provide free music lessons to children from low-income families, naming it the Emma Chen Music Education Fund. Linda and David were deeply moved by this gesture, and Emma, when told about the scholarship fund bearing her name, said she hoped it would help other kids learn to play piano like she had. Patricia, the real estate agent who had made the cruel Carnegie Hall comment, went through a period of genuine soul-searching following the incident. She couldn't forget the moment when Emma's beautiful playing had forced her to confront her own casual cruelty, and she decided to make some changes in her life. She began volunteering with a local youth arts organization, using her business skills to help with fundraising and publicity. She never told the organization about her connection to Emma's story, viewing her volunteer work not as a way to assuage guilt, but as a genuine commitment to supporting young artists and preventing other children from experiencing the kind of dismissal she had shown Emma. Robert, the contractor who had shouted for Emma to get off the stage, had a similar experience of reflection and change. He attended his daughter's dance performance later that same evening with a completely different attitude, cheering enthusiastically even though her routine was simple, and she forgot a few steps. In the weeks that followed, he made a point of attending more of his children's school events and activities, being supportive rather than critical, and he noticed that his relationship with his daughter improved significantly. He would later tell his wife that a 7-year-old girl had taught him more about courage and dignity in 10 minutes than he had learned in 40 years of life. Angela Martinez, the music teacher who had recorded Emma's performance, did indeed share it with her students, using it to spark discussions about courage, persistence, the importance of supporting fellow artists, and the power of music to transform hearts and minds. She found that the story of Emma's performance gave her a powerful teaching tool, a real example that illustrated abstract principles she had been trying to convey for years. Several of her students who had been considering quitting their instruments decided to continue, inspired by Emma's dedication and courage. As months passed, the initial media frenzy faded, allowing the Chen family to return to something approaching normal life. Emma continued her weekly lessons with Mrs. Kowalski, continued practicing daily on the family's old upright piano, continued attending her regular school and playing with friends. But the experience had changed her in subtle but important ways. She had learned that she possessed reserves of courage she hadn't known existed, that she could face fear and overcome it, that music had the power to transform not just her own emotional state, but those of her listeners as well. Emma's performance at the Chicago Youth Music Festival in January was a triumph, though a quieter one than the viral performance had been. She played a different piece this time, a Chopin waltz that showcased her growing technical skills and musical maturity, and she received warm applause and praise from the festival judges and audience. But there were no viral videos, no national news coverage, and Emma was content with this. She was beginning to understand that her musical journey was about more than achieving fame or recognition. It was about the daily practice, the gradual improvement, the deep satisfaction of mastering a challenging piece, and the joy of sharing beautiful music with others. Mrs. Kowalski, watching Emma develop over the following years, would often think back to that October evening at the community center and marvel at how a single performance could contain so many lessons and consequences. She had been teaching for over 40 years before Emma became her student, and she would teach for several more years afterward. But she would always consider Emma's Moonlight Sonata performance, played in the face of hostility and transformed into triumph through courage and artistry, to be one of the most significant and meaningful performances she had ever witnessed or helped prepare. The story of Emma's performance became part of Cleveland's local folklore, retold at community gatherings and school assemblies, usually with the lesson that we should never judge people's abilities before giving them a chance to demonstrate what they can do, that cruelty can be transformed by beauty, and that courage sometimes comes in the smallest packages. The community center kept a photograph of 7-year-old Emma at the piano hanging in their lobby, and visitors who didn't know the story would often ask about it, giving staff the opportunity to share the tale of the little girl who taught an entire community about courage, redemption, and the transformative power of music. Years later, when Emma was in high school and had indeed decided to pursue music seriously, perhaps even professionally, she would sometimes be asked to tell the story of that night at the community center. She would describe the fear she had felt when people shouted at her, the moment of decision when she could have run away but chose to play, and the extraordinary feeling of watching hostility transform into appreciation through the power of Beethoven's music flowing through her fingers. She would tell interviewers that the experience taught her that art matters, that it has the power to change hearts and minds, and that sharing beauty with the world is worth the risk of rejection or ridicule. But perhaps the most important legacy of that October evening was one that couldn't be quantified or captured in viral videos or news stories. It lived in the hearts of the people who had been present, in the way Patricia approached others with more kindness and less judgment, in the way Robert supported his children's endeavors, in the way Angela's music students learned about courage and persistence, in the way community members became more supportive of young artists and more willing to give people chances before dismissing them. Emma's 10 minutes at the piano had created ripples that spread far beyond the walls of that small community theater, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways both large and small. And for Emma herself, the experience became a foundation stone of her identity as a musician and as a person. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, that art could be a bridge between people even when words failed, and that sharing something beautiful with the world, even when that world seemed initially hostile, was one of the most worthwhile things a person could do. These lessons, learned at age 7 on a community center stage in Cleveland, would guide her through all the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead in her musical journey and in her life. The night that had begun with cruel shouts of "Get off the stage" had ended with thunderous applause and standing ovations, and the 7-year-old girl who had faced that cruelty and transformed it through courage and artistry had reminded everyone present that we are all capable of being better than our worst moments, that beauty has power, that music matters, and that we should never, ever underestimate the potential of a determined child with something important to share. Important to share.